sermon will be a stark condemnation on all yellow jackets. So if you haven't caught up on this, and I'll talk a little bit more about it in my sermon. You know, the thing about life is that life has its share of experiences, and our lives are shaped by the experiences that we go through. And you know, I experienced something that I never thought I'd experience, but I have a lot more empathy for those who have bee allergies or yellow jacket allergies. I was cutting grass Monday and just minding my own business when bang, got hit by something in my pinky. And I said, man, that smarts. That's exactly what I said. And so I went in, and Jacqueline always tells me to, you know, like put baking soda paste on it or something like that. So, you know, kind of ran it under cool water. So I went back out where I was mowing, and wouldn't you know it, bang, right in the ankle. Like this guy's little partner of vision is, you know, dead. I go, man, that hurts. So I go back inside, run that under cold water, and, you know, think nothing of it. I finish the grass, and, you know, my hand hurts, my ankle hurts. But, you know, besides being red, it just looked like any other bee sting that I had ever had. I wake up Tuesday morning, that big. Like my hand was the size of a grapefruit. Some of, I don't know if anyone here got to see it in person, but I put it on social media. And then my leg was swelling up too, really big. And of course, I'm a pastor, so we're really stubborn about going to the doctors. You might say guys are that way too, so I'm a guy and a pastor. So I'm going kicking and screaming to urgent care. But thanks to the ladies down in the RSVP office and our new office administrator, Heather, I'm so glad they pressured me to go because the infection was spreading up my leg and I was in really bad shape on Tuesday. And pretty much if I'd gotten stung by one more or two more of those, I probably wouldn't be here today. Those are a really scary experience, and that now shapes how I view my life. I'm terrified of my front yard right now. I don't want to go out there and get stung again. But again, my life has been shaped like these experiences do, that, you know, I totally feel for all of you all who have suffered with this sort of bee allergy and this kind of fear throughout your life, because I'm now in that club. The club I want to talk about, though, is the club in which we are in, where we experience a life of being with Jesus together. The disciples must have been really blessed. I don't know if y'all have ever thought of this, but you know, sometimes I think of it, about what would it have been like to hang out with Jesus. Like, can you imagine to have been, it wasn't just the 12 disciples who got to hang out with him. You know, there's a lot of other people. You know, he hung out with tax collectors and sinners. He would eat in the houses of Pharisees. He'd hang out down at the town tavern and inns and just on the side of the lake. But can you imagine how cool that must have been? Because they know what Jesus' voice sounded like. They heard Jesus sing. They laughed at Jesus' jokes, because if Jesus told a joke, we probably should laugh at it. But I imagine that Jesus was probably pretty funny, so they heard Jesus laugh. They knew what Jesus smelled like. The way it was back then, especially a traveling rabbi and his disciples, they most often bunked in the same rooms like we do at the great banquet. So the disciples knew what Jesus sounded like snoring. The Bible tells us that Jesus was human in every way, yet without sin. So Jesus could have snored. They would have known what it was like to be hugged by Jesus. They probably would have known what it was like to be held by his hand. They would have seen all the miracles firsthand. They would have seen this person who was blind and suddenly began seeing again. They would have saw that with their own eyes. Not all of them saw him hanging on the cross, but they all saw him when he presented himself alive to them again. What an amazing experience it must have been to be there with Jesus in the flesh and blood. And the disciples were blessed. But Jesus also told the disciples that even more blessed would be those who believe without even seeing. And that's the club we're in today. That's where this community that gives us the John letters was at. This letter comes to us nearing the 2nd century, so about 70, 80 years since Jesus rose from the dead, and the church was still trying to figure out exactly who it was and what it believed. And this particular church found itself in a position where they were learning to articulate what theologically we refer to as Christology. So Christology is a fancy seminary word I learned, and it basically means, what do we believe about God's revelation in Jesus Christ? And for this Johannine church is what we refer to this church as, but for this first, second century church, they had an urgent need, and they were struggling to articulate, to say what they believed when it meant they believed God revealed God's self perfectly in Jesus Christ. Because they found themselves sandwiched between sort of two opposing views. So this church had been kicked out of the synagogue because they believed that Jesus was divine. And so the synagogue finally banished them for claiming that Jesus was the Messiah and the Son of God. So on one hand, the church was still kind of redefining itself after being kicked out of the synagogue for saying Jesus was divine. Meanwhile, this church has lost a whole group of people because the church was also saying that Jesus was human, that God became flesh. And this group over here were called the Gnostics. And the Gnostics believed that Jesus was God, but he only appeared to be human. Because for the Gnostics, it seemed irrational to believe that God could die on the cross, that God could be human. There's a lot of other differences between these Gnostics, but this is the context the church finds itself in. And they have to struggle to figure out, what do we mean by saying that Jesus is so divine that God is kicked out of the synagogue? But also, what does it mean that we believe he was also human? And that's why all these Gnostics, all these people, left our church. So the church wrestled with how to express what they believed in regards to Jesus' divinity and his humanity. And this debate would not resolve itself once we got this creed in 1 John. There would be two councils, the Council of Nicaea and the Council of Chalcedon, I think, in the 4th century. And even during the Reformation, there was always this debate about how could Jesus be fully human and fully divine. And that's a lecture for a whole other day, because I move on to say it's still something we're trying to figure out still today. Right? Isn't this one of the hardest things in faith to really wrap your head around? This idea that somehow Jesus is completely divine, but also he was completely human. We talk a lot, and you see a lot written about the faith of our founding fathers. You know the faith of Thomas Jefferson, right? So Thomas Jefferson was a believer, but Thomas Jefferson couldn't go so far to believe that Jesus was divine. And I know this to be true because if you go to the bookstore at Monticello, you can buy what they call the Jefferson Bible. And do you all know what the Jefferson Bible is? It is the Gospels with all the miracles taken out. So Thomas Jefferson had a hard time at this age of rationalizing that Jesus was divine. He wanted to believe in a very rational and a very supernatural Jesus. And there's a lot of people in the world that still kind of share this same, Jeffersonian biblical idea that Jesus is just an ordinary guy. He was a historical person. He was an influential person who came along in history. He's got some really good things to teach, but he was quote-unquote just a man. And I know these people pretty well because a lot of them are my friends. I have a lot of friends who often, when we talk about Jesus, they love to talk about Jesus, but they can't take that leap of faith to believe that he is divine as well, that this person in the flesh was actually God in the flesh. So still today we have those who just want Jesus to be merely human and a pretty cool guy, but not put their faith in him as a God. On the other hand, I believe we have a group of people that make Jesus into this big superhero and really blow up this idea of his divinity. So we have this Jesus who is up in the sky. If you pray the right prayer, he'll snap his fingers and grant you a wish. And if you're good enough, one day he will swoop down from the sky and take you up into the heavens where you'll live happily ever after. Sort of a romanticized, superhero-sized Jesus that doesn't have the earthly, human elements that I really love. And I don't know where you all are. I know that what this creed does is place us somewhere in between. That how do we put our faith in someone who was just an ordinary guy like you and I, but also is the greatest superhero the world has ever known, for he was God himself. So what does this creed teach us? Number one, this creed affirms that the pre-existent Word became flesh, just like the Gospel of John, to share the human experience with us. This is what this creed primarily affirms, and I'll say it again. This creed affirms that the pre-existent Word that was with God became flesh to share the human experience with us. If you heard when I read, there was a strong emphasis of this community that was giving us this affirmation, where they said that we have heard with our own ears, we saw with our own eyes, we touched with our own hands. They say it twice in this affirmation to emphasize that what we saw, this Word made flesh, was real. Something we could hear, someone we could see, someone we could touch. And this was an obvious contrast to the Gnostics I was talking about earlier. That the Gnostics believed that Jesus only seemed to be human, that he just pretended, that he had to put on this human garb so people could understand him. But when it came to his life, he was pretending. And he just pretended to die on the cross. Instead, what this creed affirms, I think, is far more difficult and more rewarding to believe, that this God took on very real flesh and became a very real person and very much suffered and died on the cross. And this idea of the Word being revealed is very important in this creed as well. In Greek, the word for revealed means made visible. That this wasn't a God who was hidden and mysterious like the Old Testament. This isn't a God who was all about smoke and mirrors in the temple. This wasn't a God on some enormous throne up in heaven. That the God that they saw in Jesus was made visible, was made very real to them, and looked them right in the face. And the reason that they say that Jesus came and was revealed in the flesh was so that we could be a community. So in that passage, they said that Jesus was real, in a way we could hear, see, and touch. He was revealed so that we might have fellowship with you, and we all might have fellowship with him. This creed affirms that Jesus came in the flesh so that we might be a community. In Greek, the word koinonia sometimes gets translated as fellowship, but it simply means a community or a partnership, where we share the human experience together. So in short, what this creed affirms, what we learn about this fully human and fully divine Jesus today, is that the Word became flesh. God became incarnate. God did that to share the human experience with us. And Jesus did that so that he might make us a community to share the human experience together. And as the passage ends, simply to be our light in the darkness. God gave us each other. That's how we see, that's how we hear, that's how we touch Jesus today. We're not blessed like the disciples where we get to actually hang out with Jesus and figure out if he's the one snoring in the room. That's always one of the great mysteries of the great banquet on night one. But that's how Jesus still is very real and in the flesh with us, is he's given us each other. And again, I experience that in a very real way whenever we do these great banquet weekends, is that on these weekends you are very much exposed to the very real laughter and touch and joy and presence of being with Jesus. You know, every time we come to this table, that's another way that we are given something we can touch and feel and embrace Jesus. But again, the primary way that we still embrace and hear and see Jesus is you all right here sitting in the pews next to each other. That's Jesus. Jesus in the flesh. He referred to you all as his body. And I don't take that for granted. You all, as far as a pastor goes, I cannot be more blessed that you have prayed when my nephew had cancer. You're praying now for my sister who was here last week going through a divorce. And then just this week, do not take for granted if you are on social media. As a pastor, I freak out. When they took my heart rate in the exam room, it was 124. I was pumping. And the doctor said, "What? Do you have tremors?" I said, "No, you're freaking me out. I don't want to be here." But listen, I put that photo of my hand on social media, and you all started commenting on my Facebook. And as you're commenting on my Facebook, you are helping chill me out in that exam. You weren't there with me, but you brought the presence of Jesus to me to calm me down. And you were a huge help. And then all the follow-ups and stuff afterwards, I'm just moved, not because you all care, but because you showed me the caring love of Jesus in a very real way. And even across the social media. So what can we learn about all this? What can we learn from this affirmation of faith and apply in our lives? Is number one, the creed calls us to testify. And that's the big word, maybe I haven't emphasized enough with this creed, is this is a declaration. This is a proclamation. This is a testification. This is a witness from a church. And we are called as individuals in a church to share our witness. Who do we believe Jesus to be? What have we heard Jesus say? What have we seen Jesus do? How have we experienced Jesus very real in our lives as individuals or together? And this affirmation tells us that we need to learn to share it. That's one thing the Great Banquet helps us to do, is how do we talk about our faith? But look, this affirmation doesn't set the bar that high. This is not that theological. I mean, yes, it's really hard to still wrap your head around the humanity-divinity thing. But what this church from the 1st, 2nd century is saying is simply what they heard and saw. And that's all we are challenged to do as Christians and as a church in the world. The second thing this creed reminds us to do is that the primary identification of a church should be a caring community. Church don't get that reputation these days. We're hypocrites and we condemn people. But this creed reminds us that what the church ought to do best is care for one another, care for others, and care a lot about Jesus. That's what the church is supposed to be, is simply a caring community. And I think we have a pretty caring church. Maybe we need to let more people know and experience that care together. And here's the last thing about this creed, is it's always a reminder of grace. I love finding more out about grace in the Bible, that the reason that Jesus came, the reason that God became flesh, wasn't because we deserved it, wasn't because we were perfect, wasn't because we had made it, wasn't because we had prayed enough, wasn't because we believed everything. Instead, this creed simply says that Jesus came because people were in darkness and they needed light. This is the message this creed says, that God is light for those in darkness. Jesus said how blessed people would be, and that's us, who would be here believing and affirming our faith still today without ever having seen him in the flesh. I'm kind of bummed we don't get to hang with Jesus, because I bet he was pretty cool to hang out with. I bet he had some great remedies for yellow jacket stings. Could have used them on Monday. But he's still here sharing the human experience with us. And the way he does that is through our prayer life, but also through one another. My friends, we have a call to be Jesus to the world. We also have a call to be Jesus to one another. And I'll admit, I still struggle. I can't wrap my head around this whole Jesus is divine and fully human. But in the end, I kind of err with the reformers. Is that during the Reformation, Calvin and the likes simply said that it was too much to try to figure out. Instead, what mattered was that Jesus came to save a world of sinners. And my friend, I have experienced Jesus in the flesh. I have seen him in your eyes. I have felt him in your prayers. I have heard him in your laughter. I have heard him in your singing. And I hope you have heard and seen and touched the same of my life and ministry to you. So as the church, let's be Jesus to one another, and let's be Jesus to